This photograph was taken on a late September afternoon in 1875, between Manchester and Liverpool. At first glance, it looks like nothing more than a routine circus portrait. 37 performers stood together, arranged in careful symmetry before the camera lens. Acrobats balanced confidently on wooden stakes, their bodies suspended 5 meters above the ground. Children stood in the front row, their painted faces fixed with uneasy stillness. Behind them, the towering silhouettes of giants loomed, while contortionists, strongmen, and Siamese twins pressed into formation. The great canvas tent of Godfrey's Grand Menagerie rose behind them, a proud symbol of Victorian spectacle. To anyone looking at this image, it would appear as just another record of traveling showpeople, another fragment of entertainment culture in a restless age. But hidden inside this photograph is a truth that would not reveal itself until the night had ended. 6 hours after the shutter clicked, none of these faces would remain alive. Every single one of the men, women, and children in this image would be dead. Their final performance was not on the stage but beneath the crushing collapse of their own tent, destroyed by a storm so sudden and violent that it erased hundreds of lives in minutes. What you are seeing, then, is not just a group portrait. It is the last record of an entire world moments before extinction. Every smile suppressed, every costume carefully worn, every painted child's face in the front row. These details belong to people who did not know they were living their final hours. If stories like this disturb you, if you believe forgotten lives should never be silenced, then subscribe and comment below to keep memory alive on Grave of the Shadows. To understand the meaning of this photograph, we must step closer and see the individuals whose lives it captured. At the center stands Silas Godfrey, the owner of the Grand Menagerie and Curiosity Show. His figure is unmistakable, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark frock coat, his expression both stern and commanding. For more than 15 years, Godfrey had built his name across England, Scotland, and Wales. He was no mere fairground charlatan. He understood the Victorian appetite for spectacle, and he fed it carefully, an intoxicating mix of wonder, fear, and fascination. Clustered around him were the principal acrobats, a family of 6 Polish siblings. They were famous for their daring aerial routines, swinging from ropes and bars with a precision that seemed to defy death itself. In the photograph, one of them grips a trapeze bar, poised to climb, his face frozen in a mask of confidence. To the far right stand 3 giants, men who towered above ordinary height, each exceeding 2 meters. Their great size, born of pituitary conditions unknown at the time, made them both marvels and commodities. Among them is Constance Fairchild, the elastic woman. Thin and sharp-eyed, she could twist her body into contortions that left audiences gasping. Nearby, 2 brothers, Siamese twins joined at the chest, faced the lens together, their bond transformed from private burden into public exhibition. And scattered in the front row are the children. Some were born into the troupe, others acquired through means whispered about but never confirmed, purchased, abandoned, or stolen. Their faces tell the most haunting story of all. There are no smiles, no restless fidgeting, no mischief. Only silence, the drilled quietness of children raised as part of the show. The tent looms high behind them, stretched taut against the gray sky of England. At that moment, no one could imagine its collapse. No one could foresee the sudden storm that would rip it from the ground and drag 300 souls into chaos. This was not merely a circus gathering. It was a fragile family built from difference and survival, united for one more night. And this photograph, innocent to the casual eye, was the silent witness to their final day on Earth. September 1875 was restless with shifting skies. That morning, the town lay quiet beneath a pale sun, and the men of Godfrey's troupe busied themselves with the mechanics of performance. The tent had been pitched days earlier on a rented field between the smoking chimneys of factories. Stakes were hammered deep, ropes drawn tight, the massive central mast rising like a proud monument of oak. To the casual observer, it appeared unshakable. Children darted between wagons as vendors prepared their stock. Barrels of sweet cider, trays of sugared almonds, and chestnuts blackened over hot coals. Tickets had been sold all week. 3 pence for the wooden benches, 6 pence for the closer rows, a full shilling for the reserved seats where families of status sat proudly in their Sunday attire. For the working man, whose wage rarely passed 20 shillings a week, it was a luxury worth the sacrifice. By dusk, hundreds were making their way to the grounds. Families with eager children, apprentices on holiday, even local gentry seeking diversion. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the smell of roasted nuts and the smoke of pipes. The weather, though unsettled, seemed ordinary. The Royal Meteorological Society would later record the month as unusually stormy. But in that hour there was no sign of doom. The skies were clouded, the air damp, yet no one feared more than the drizzle of a passing shower. Behind the tent, performers rehearsed quietly. The Polish siblings stretched their limbs, whispering in their native tongue. Constance Fairchild practiced her bends with calm precision. The giants leaned together, speaking low, as children sat cross-legged polishing shoes or mending costumes. It was, by all outward appearance, another ordinary evening in industrial England, a community drawn together by curiosity and the promise of spectacle. Nothing betrayed the truth that lingered unseen in the wood of the mast, where moisture had rotted fibers no eye could see. Nothing betrayed the atmospheric collision building on the horizon, waiting to strike with sudden violence. Within hours, the joy of expectation would turn to chaos, and the very structure that symbolized wonder would become a weapon of death. As night descended, the tent glowed with lantern light, its canvas walls shimmering like a beacon across the damp fields. The crowd filed in, pressing onto the wooden benches, children climbing eagerly onto their parents' laps. Musicians tuned their instruments while Godfrey himself prepared to deliver his booming introduction. Outside, however, the sky was shifting. A cold front had begun its silent approach, colliding with warmer air that had lingered all day. The weather, still unremarkable to the audience, was quietly gathering force. Unbeknownst to the hundreds seated within, the grand oak mast at the center of the tent bore a secret wound. Moisture had seeped into its core over years of service, hollowing fibers until the structure stood strong only in appearance. To the eye, it was flawless, straight, polished, immovable. But deep inside, the rot spread like a hidden crack in bone, waiting for the precise moment of strain. That night, the strain would come. The performance began with practiced splendor. The Polish acrobats soared above the crowd, twisting through the haze of lantern smoke, their bodies suspended on ropes that swayed slightly more than usual. Constance bent her frame into impossible shapes while the giants stood like silent guardians at the edge of the ring. The twins were presented to murmurs of awe, their lives transformed into curiosity. From every corner came applause, whistles, and coins tossed toward the stage. Then the first gust of wind struck. The canvas rippled audibly, its seams groaning against the pull. Some in the crowd barely noticed, dismissing it as an ordinary draft. But the performers exchanged brief glances. They were veterans of canvas life. They knew the language of tents. Another gust followed, stronger, rattling lanterns and raising nervous laughter. Above them, the mast began to creak. A low vibration felt through the wooden floorboards. It was the sound of weakness announcing itself, though few recognized it. Still, the show continued. Godfrey, ever the master of confidence, raised his voice to compete with the restless air. Outside, the storm gathered its strength. Inside, the audience leaned forward, oblivious to the invisible clock now ticking down toward catastrophe. At 10:03 that night, the storm revealed its full violence. It did not arrive gradually, as most tempests do, but as a wall of air that tore across the field with sudden fury. The canvas snapped like a living thing, lantern flames flickering wildly before extinguishing in a rush of darkness. For a single suspended heartbeat, silence held the tent. And then came the crack. The oak mast, strained by winds and weakened from within, split with a sound like cannon fire. It did not break cleanly but exploded, shards of wood flying through the air like jagged missiles. The steel cables, once tight with balance, lashed free and sliced across the crowded space. They struck benches, bodies, and beams with lethal precision. Screams rose instantly, swallowed by the roar of tearing canvas as the roof collapsed upon 300 trapped souls. In the chaos, panic surged faster than reason. Families lunged for exits they could no longer see. Children cried out in the dark, their voices lost under the suffocating weight of wet fabric. The canvas, drenched by sudden rain, weighed tons. It smothered the crowd, folding into suffocating pockets where air thinned quickly. Some fought to tear holes, others clawed at ropes, but each movement tightened the trap. Performers tried to act. The strong man shielded children with his body. Constance Fairchild bent herself across an elderly woman, creating a desperate shelter. The twins reached outward, holding back a section of canvas with all their strength until it crushed them flat. In those moments, the boundary between spectacle and survival dissolved. Outside, townspeople ran toward the noise, but the storm's force made rescue impossible. The tent writhed like a monstrous creature pinned to the ground, the muffled screams inside fading as minutes dragged into eternity. When the wind at last weakened, silence hung heavier than the rain. Beneath that canvas lay hundreds, lifeless, and the stage that once promised wonder had become a mass grave. When the winds finally eased, the survivors outside rushed forward with torches and trembling hands. What they found was no longer a circus tent but a tangled mountain of canvas, wood, and twisted steel. The storm had pressed it down so tightly that it seemed fused to the earth. Men pulled desperately at the edges, slicing at ropes with knives, but the fabric resisted. Every tug revealed not the living but broken limbs, faces turned pale, eyes fixed in terror. It took hours before the wreckage could be dismantled piece by piece. Underneath lay a scene no words could capture fully. Hundreds crushed together, their lives extinguished in a matter of minutes. Mothers clutched children who would never breathe again. Husbands were found bent across wives in a final act of instinctive protection. Performers, once curiosities for crowds, now lay among the very spectators who had come to watch them. The division between entertainer and audience had vanished in death. Authorities arrived the next morning, stunned by the magnitude of loss. 317 bodies were counted, each one catalogued as best as the shaken coroner could manage. There were not enough coffins, not enough grave diggers, not enough prayers to cover so much sudden absence. A nearby field was consecrated in haste, and common graves were dug by the dozens. Bodies were wrapped in sheets when cloth could be spared, left bare when it could not. Yet even as the dead were buried, questions rose quickly. Who was responsible? Was it the mast, the builders, the weather, or the man who led the show? Silas Godfrey lay among the victims, silencing easy blame. Records would later show gaps, evasions, and even secrecy. Newspapers printed only brief notices before the story faded into deliberate silence. For Victorian society, it was easier to forget than to face the uncomfortable truth. For a time, the tragedy lingered on people's lips. In nearby towns, whispers carried tales of the circus disaster, each retelling more dreadful than the last. But within weeks, silence closed over it like earth on a grave. Local newspapers printed a handful of paragraphs, then shifted their pages to other matters. Reports that once named the victims grew shorter, until finally the event vanished altogether from public memory. To dwell on it was to invite uncomfortable truths, that respectable families had paid to watch freak shows, that panic had led to trampling, that society's fascination had turned to complicity in death. The field itself was left untouched. No stone, no marker, no carved memorial ever announced what had happened there. Seasons passed, grass grew, sheep grazed. To later generations, it became nothing more than an empty stretch of land, ordinary and unremarkable. Yet those who lived nearby avoided it at dusk. They spoke of strange voices in the wind, of shadows slipping through the mist, of cries that seemed to rise from beneath the soil. The imagination of grief took on spectral form, as if the unburied memory demanded some acknowledgement. Nearly 50 years later, in 1923, the land was disturbed again. A warehouse was planned, and workers digging foundations struck bone. What they unearthed were not relics of ancient history but the remains of men, women, and children buried hastily in 1875. Skeletons entangled together, rusted trinkets clutched in their hands, remnants of costumes still clinging faintly to decayed fabric. Construction halted as archaeologists arrived, carefully exhuming and reinterring the remains in a cemetery with a modest plaque. The inscription was brief, in memory of those who perished in the Circus tragedy, September 1875. But it was not until 1967 that the photograph itself resurfaced. Found in a family trunk, forgotten among letters and glass plates, it revealed the faces of the doomed troupe once more. Each figure, frozen in that moment before disaster, forced the past back into focus. What had been buried in silence returned as testimony. The photo became the last bridge between memory and oblivion, proof that they had lived, performed, and died together, even if society tried to forget them. Look again at the photograph. It is easy to see costumes, tricks of spectacle, the strangeness of giants and contortionists, children taught to stand still as curiosities. But beyond that surface lies a truth Victorian society chose to ignore, that each face was a complete human life. The acrobat who forced his fear into courage each time he climbed. The elastic woman whose joints ached long after applause ended. The twins who carried not only the weight of their own lives but the eyes of every gawking spectator. The children who dreamed of something more than the canvas walls of a tent. When the storm struck, the labels of freak or performer dissolved instantly. In those final minutes, they acted not as curiosities but as people. Sacrificing, shielding, trying to save others. Strength bent itself over children. Bodies became fragile shelters for strangers. Even as they died, they revealed a humanity that society had refused to grant them in life. And yet, after the graves were filled, memory faltered. Respectable citizens avoided mention of their presence in the tent. Officials deflected responsibility. Newspapers closed their columns. History, so often written by those in power, let the event sink into the shadows. It was more convenient to remember nothing than to admit that the powerless had suffered without justice. This silence was the deeper tragedy. It revealed how a society that celebrated progress and morality could still weigh lives unequally, mourning the elite while discarding those who did not fit its image. The storm may have torn down the tent, but it was indifference that buried the story. To remember them now is to resist that silence. It is to look at the photograph and see not anomalies but men, women, and children who laughed, feared, hoped, and died. By naming them, by telling their story, we perform an act of justice that history denied. And by carrying their memory forward, we remind ourselves that dignity should never depend on spectacle. When the last echo of the storm faded that night in 1875, silence fell upon the muddy field. Beneath the collapsed tent lay hundreds who had come seeking wonder and left in tragedy. No speeches were given, no monuments raised, no grand ceremonies of mourning. Their lives ended in obscurity, and their memory was pushed aside by a society unwilling to face its own failings. Yet the photograph endured, waiting in shadows for nearly a century before returning to the light. That image, ordinary at first glance, is no longer ordinary once you know its truth. Each expression becomes a final testimony. The woman in the second row was to be married the following week. The tall man at the back had prepared to leave for America. The child in front had just begun to read. Futures unwritten were erased in 40 minutes of chaos. These were not curiosities, not attractions, not faceless victims. They were people, and they deserved to be remembered as such. History often forgets those who do not fit its favored image. But forgetting is a choice. And each time we choose to look at these photographs, each time we tell these stories, we fight against that silence. We remind ourselves that dignity belongs to all lives, no matter how fragile, no matter how unusual, no matter how easily erased by official memory. If the story moved you, if it unsettled you, if it awakened questions about how society decides whose lives are worthy of remembrance, then let that discomfort lead you. Share it, speak about it, and most importantly, ensure these stories are never buried again. Join us here at Grave of the Shadows, where forgotten lives and silenced voices are brought back into light. Subscribe, comment, and help carry these memories forward, because in remembering them, we refuse to let history bury them twice.